Thank you everyone for joining us so far. I know we're going to have a few more jumping in as we go through, but I'd like to welcome everyone to the Coltech webinar that we're basing on project delivery and how businesses are hitting their delivery targets. Very privileged and excited to have a real expert panel today of Bryan Mishkin, who's CTO for NewPoint Media Group, Adam McCombs, Director of Engineering at BookOutdoors, and my good friend Nathan Biles, who's currently working as an SVP for engineering at the White House. I suppose first things first, do a little introduction to the panel. So Bryan, if you just want to do a little intro.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Bryan Mishkin. I'm a CTO from NewPoint Media Group, and I work with different clients to help them get their delivery on track. Oftentimes in my career, I find myself coming into a situation where things have been completely and totally shattered and blown up, and they're looking to me to solve those problems and get things on track so the business can be on track. And so I've got a lot of expertise in delivery. I was an engineer by trade early on in my career and worked my way up through various promotions to the CTO chair, where I lead NewPoint Media Group right now.
Excellent. It's we done the Austin Tech Leaders podcast in the past, Bryan, and you had some really interesting points around people, processes, and technology. So I'm interested to hear dive into that a little bit more. Yep. Adam, wouldn't mind giving us a little intro into yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Adam McCombs. I'm head of engineering at BookOutdoors. We're an online travel agency, very similar to Expedia or Booking.com. Biggest exception for us is we focus on RV parks, campgrounds, and glamping resorts. Previous to BookOutdoors, I ran a digital agency for about 10 years. So lots of projects, lots of deadlines, worked on a lot of different range of digital projects. So
excellent. We've again had many conversations in the past. I know you're going to have some great insights into this. And last but not least, Nathan, a little introduction for us, please, mate.
Yeah, so a long-time entrepreneur. Started out my career pretty young in startups, and then had some good success there. Went into some consulting. I had an agency as well for about 8 years. So I'm very familiar with that as well and helping others deliver. And then now I'm back in I was in this startup world, had a couple of startups the last 5 to 6 years in security and fintech, and currently leading senior VP engineering at the White House as we're building an incubator for a lot of great startup projects in the government. So
very exciting times. We'll dive straight into it. Obviously, within any tech business or any growing business, but especially within sort of tech project delivery, preparation is probably the key to success. So I was probably opening up to anyone, but how would you suggest a growing tech business or a tech company would best prepare themselves to deliver their projects?
Who's going to jump in first?
Bryan, let's go with Bryan.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say understanding what you actually want to do in the first place and understanding strategically how it benefits your business are two key things that are important, right? If you can't specify, oftentimes when I come into an organization, they're telling me engineering's not working, engineering's not delivering anything. And most of the time, what I find out is some of the problem is in engineering, most of the problem lives elsewhere. And what I mean when I say that is that I'll look at the requirements that are being provided to engineers as input, and sometimes there's nothing even in there, right? So if you gave somebody a work order and you said, here, go build this for me. If you gave a construction worker a work order and said, here, go build me this house without a blueprint, what do you think would happen? Right? And so that's oftentimes what I find happening is the inputs for the engineering team are, not good, not specifying, what they need. And engineers, whether they're onshore or off, tend to be somewhat literal in terms of what they're taking. Sometimes they'll raise their hands and ask questions, but if you give them something, they're literally going to implement that to the specification. So the more information you can provide that's relevant, the better. And the more you understand what your request is that you're asking for from your engineers, the better and the faster that you're going to get the output. So a little bit more work up front gets you much better outcomes when you get to execution in the project lifecycle.
Excellent. And Adam, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of that. I would say, if we're talking about how you can be best prepared, I think a well-defined scope is definitely the best way to achieve that. Or if you're working in a Kanban or continuous cycle, well-defined acceptance criteria as well too. I think a lot of times, to echo what Bryan said, if you say, hey, go build me X, a lot of times engineers will go off and build you X, and you might have wanted Y. And so I think you have to be very specific in terms of the things you are expecting to achieve within a project. And those things have to be outlined and documented and spec'd. And if you don't, I think you suffer the consequences.
Well, and I think one of the things that you need to do is make sure that there's common adherence to those standards, right? That's a great point on the acceptance criteria and on how you write these tickets. Everybody has to be trained up and understand the standard way to actually write a ticket in format, right? And so whether that's a bug that uses a specific format or a user story that's a new requirement, everybody has to use that same format so that we get the same requirements and we can review them the same way, and we can, fix problems more readily. So if it's a bug, and you want to fix bugs, you got to use a specific format that helps the engineer find the bug faster. If it's a user story, you have to use a specific format that helps you get to exactly what needs to be implemented in code faster. But regardless, using those standard formats and processes can really help you. And if you don't have those standards, getting prepared might involve getting those standards in place and saying, this is how we're going to write tickets for this project.
Yeah, I think Adam and Bryan hit like the biggest things as far as defining the scope and everything. And, Bryan, you just mentioned about like how you do things. I think another perspective that I always think about when starting a new project and being prepared is within the team, providing a good ethos is what the word that I really like to use is like, there's the idea, especially with startups, when you don't have as much structure and maybe you don't have as much resources, you have to define like what corners like we kind of understand we need to round maybe. And one of the ways to do that is to define how you do it. Like how are we going to round these corners and how we do it before we even know that the corner exists, right? And so defining your culture, your ethos, how we do it. One, I think, old quote I've heard before is like, what is it? No war plan survives its first shot. It's understanding that like, okay, what happens when the scope or the acceptance criteria can't be hit? I mean, I think if you have experience in engineering, sometimes the scope of work, you realize there's technical details that we can't actually solve for in your scoping. So what is the way to address those? And I think it's really important to define that and then kind of understand like where those holes could possibly be ahead of time. That way, when you get there, everybody on the team is aware of how we need to adjust. And the quicker we can adjust to big, flags or issues like that as a whole, the quicker we'll be able to actually hit those deliveries. So yeah, defining the scope and defining culture around how things are done.
I would say too, on that ethos, one of the things is giving context to the project that you're working on, or if it's smaller than a full-size project, giving context to the task or the story that you're working on. Why are you doing that? Because I think without context, a lot of times, I think you get lost in why you're trying to achieve, X, Y, Z.
Yeah, I think that's the people context of it too, right? Or the people aspect of it, where people want to be motivated and they want to know what they're doing and how it's going to benefit the company and how it's going to contribute to what else is going on as a whole, right? And so sharing that information, being clear on what your strategy is, and being able to articulate that to not just engineers but everybody is going to make your project a lot more successful. right?
Does that lend go back to, obviously we're talking about people and building the culture like you mentioned, Nathan, but is it like, so I read something recently about any sort of growing or successful team or whatever, maybe a project, getting, before defining where you're going, getting the right people in place and then using them to define where it's going to go. So like getting the right people on the bus before you know where the bus is going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's like also a chicken and egg thing, right? You have to know a little bit of both sides before you go. Like there's those things like do what you have with what you got. So sometimes you look at a situation and say, these are the resources, these are the people that I have. So what can we build with these people? Or these are the people that I can get. But then there's the other side of things. It's like, if you're building a mobile app, you're not going to go out and hire Python engineers and say, okay, we need to hire Python engineers. So you have to know a little bit about where you're going before you can have the right people. But yeah, that's a very important aspect of it. Like understanding your scope and hiring the right people who can actually do that work first. And then on the flip side of things is like the industry of it. Like if I have to say, hey, I need to hire 30 Rust engineers in Austin by the end of this month. I'm like, well, I'm sorry, you're not going to hire 30 this year. Those resources don't exist yet, especially quality. So there's like a little bit of both. Like you have to understand what the market is providing in those resources and understanding like, hey, can I actually hire, 30 Rust engineers this year for this project? And if the answer is no, then you got to go back and look at the requirements of the project and say, let's use a different technology or whatever. So it's understanding the scope, but then, yeah, finding the right people. You're not going to, I use this analogy when talking with other clients in the past. It's like, you're not going to hire a go-kart driver to drive Formula One off the bat, but he's going to have a lot of skills he needs from go-karting to Formula One, but you got to make sure you're hiring the Formula One driver for the Formula One race. So you have to know what race you're in first.
100%.
I think I view our role as leaders to set those guide rails and those parameters for teams and let the teams then self-organize, right? And if that means you got to bring other people in, you bring other people in. But as leaders, to the point that was being made, you don't want them going off, you don't want to tell them to build a website and then they go build a mobile app, right? I mean, you have to provide them with some guidance, not only with the scope, but with what we can do, right? As leaders, we know what the financial constraints are. We know what the time constraints are. So we don't want them going out and buying a product that's going to be very expensive either, that's not in the budget, right? So if we set those parameters and then let the team kind of self-organize with some supervision, I think they'll be really successful. But if you leave individual contributors and people, to try to self-organize on their own without any guidance, the results won't end up the way you expect unless you have somebody like experienced that kind of emerges as a leader and can really lead that discussion.
Yeah, and I think you have to identify the stakeholders and decision makers as well too. And maybe it's an internal project and somebody internal, a manager or supervisor, VP might be signing off on a project. Or if you're an agency and you're working externally, it's important to identify who's going to give the final approval. There might be a corresponding project manager on that side, and that's great. I love it when that happens, but you have to identify, are they going to give the final approval, or is a VP or CEO, are they going to step in and say, I don't really like it that way, and sort of tank the project at the end. So I think identifying those key decision makers or stakeholders early and including that in the spec of the project is vitally important as well too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one other piece that I think is important at the beginning of a project when you're pretty early on, even after you scope it. And that's this idea that I have that projects have unknowns with them from the beginning. And as the project evolves and goes along, those unknowns turn into knowns. And at the end of the project, most of your unknowns are all knowns. So you can forecast and predict much more reliably. But at the beginning of the project, you have a lot of unknowns, and that could be technical, it could be people, it could be other things. And so what I've started talking to clients about is, okay, now we've got the scope, we know what the project's going to be. What don't we know? What are the unknown things that we need to answer right now that are going to give us clarity on what the scope is, who we need to hire, what we need to do, how we approach this project, right? And we list those out, and then we spend some time doing discovery on those, right? How do we support multi-factor authentication in WordPress? How do we, do X, Y, or Z that we want to do? And we come up with a couple of approaches for them, and we can talk about them as a team. But then at a high level, we know we're going to use OAuth for authentication because that's best for single sign-on. We've done the discovery on it. We know it can work with our system, and we've proven that out, right? And everybody kind of sees it. That also affords you the ability to produce documentation around, how to use a system like that or how that'll work within the project, right? So you can take your scope now and take those unknowns, turn them into knowns, and get down to the specific requirements that you would need, knowing how the system you're going to integrate with or work with actually functions, right? Having more knowledge lights your way, as it were. And so, once you have that scope, I think it's important to understand what your unknowns are. And those could be people too, right? And then go fill those gaps, right? And then go fill those nodes. It's like the bus analogy we were talking about. You'd walk the bus around, make sure everything's working, because you don't really know that everything's working or it'll start up when you turn the key. So you walk around, make sure the tires are all aired up and everything. And if they're not, well, you go, hey, we got a tire we got to air up before we get going on this thing. All right, what's that going to take? It's going to take an inflator. Let's go get the inflator and inflate that tire, right? It's a very simple example, but the same is true of just about any unknown. Once you discover it, then you need to rectify it and address it.
Nice.
And that can make project forecasting a lot more accurate. Frameworks like Scaled Agile have embraced that conceptually as well, but that's kind of where I picked some of that up from was and every time I've done it, the actual execution of the project has gone a lot faster and been a lot more reliable as a result.
Fantastic. I mean, that's some great advice. So in terms of like sort of trying to, well, it's very difficult to put in package that all of that information up into a few simple terms, but some of the notes I made there is making sure we're implementing the right standards in the team, building the correct team ethos, understanding what happens when things can't be done and how where we arrange that, or how we cope with that, fully defining the scope. So we understand the people who are working on the project, so the team understand what the benefits are, what it's going to, how it's going to affect the business, and understanding the acceptance criteria, and then from there as well, having a look around and seeing where these gaps could form, and if we need to bring people in to be able to solve those issues quickly. So I mean, that's all A1 advice, and I suppose one of the next points we wanted to cover was the opposite to that. What was going to hold delivery back? I suppose just not having that stuff. There's not having any of those things. Moving on. No.
Yeah, exactly.
But jokes aside, we've all seen, you guys have worked on, I've seen over the years, projects go badly or not be delivered on time or not hit their milestones. And would you say that one of the main reasons for that is the definition of the scope, not understanding what we're meant to be doing, or is there other factors that are going to affect that more?
Yeah, I would say I would start with resources. Oftentimes, I think projects are outlined with the best hopes of completion, and I think you have to work with the resources that you have. If you have a project and that project is scoped for 5 engineers, but you only have 3 available, then I think you have to adjust and take a realistic look at the timeline and scope and make sure that you can hit those deadlines that you've agreed to. And then the other thing I would say is, in terms of what can hold a project back is external factors as well too, especially if you're working with external systems and dealing with other resources outside of your company or your organization. You're dependent on a third-party API or third-party documentation, or there's a third party writing copy or providing designs. A lot of times with projects and the delivery projects, you're reliant on those external resources sometimes as well too, and that can also adversely affect how well you deliver and if you deliver on time or not.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think early in my career when I was a line manager, I'm just going to say this because I don't ever do that, and I don't think anybody else does, but unrealistic expectations from the C-suite and the executive suite were the number one reason that delivery would get into trouble from the outset, right? And I say that because I can call a project a year out and give you a sense of what the ballpark is going to be on that project with a very basic scope. And I, not to toot my own horn, but I'm pretty accurate with it. And so I've had an executive say, I need this project in 9 months. And you have three levers you can move: time, resources, and scope, right? And so when someone comes to you with time and says it has to be done by this, well, I learned later in my career, the immediate response should be, well, what are you going to move with resources or scope? Because without those things, you're locking me into time. So I need those other levers to be able to play with, right? Very upfront. But C-suite folks just come in and say, I need this in 9 months, and expect it. And so if we as leaders just say, yep, I can get that for you, we're not doing ourselves any service either, right? We have to be realistic set realistic expectations with those around us on what can and can't be delivered in a specific time. And so it's not a no, I can't do that in 9 months, but it's well, let's look at the scope and let's see what we're going to be willing to chop, or resources we're going to be willing to add, depending on what the budget is, to get it for you in that time. And if you're not willing to move those things for me, then, I can't guarantee that I'm going to be able to get you this project in the time that you want it. Right. And so they can choose, but I always tell them, you get to pick two. The third one I get to deal with, and whatever that is, that is. So if you want to pick the number of resources and the amount of time, then I get to pick the scope. Nobody ever likes that, by the way. If you get to pick the scope and the time, then I get to pick the resources. Nobody likes that either, because you get to spend money. But when you put it like that and put it back on them to make those decisions, then they really have to think about what they're doing, right? And so at the very outset, that's where early in my career, I was getting a lot of trouble, and I still see it today. But I come, whenever I work with a client or a company coming in, I tell them point blank, now I'm going to tell you how long this is going to take, and you may not like it, but that's realistically what I think it's going to take based on all my experience. And so, we got to figure out how to get you what you need, but the answer isn't to just tell me to go make it happen somehow through the miracle of magic, right? Which oftentimes happened early in my career.
Yeah, and I really want to add on to that, because that was actually one of the things I was going to bring up, specific time, resources, and scope. The really funny thing is about time, resources, and scope is, no matter how way you put it, and first of all, I agree with you 100%, Brian, but I do feel like there is a case of maybe 1 in a million times this happens, but it has happened in my career, so I do want to mention it, where someone did come to me and say, or not me, but to other people, this has happened as well, but there's unlimited resources, you have 6 months, here's the scope. And it's like, okay, well, which one are you going to give me? And they say, basically, I'll give you scope and time, or I'll give you time. Sorry, I will give you unlimited resources, right? But I need you to do this scope in this amount of time. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter how much money you have or how many people you're going to give resources to. There are also expectations that need to be set for those other ones, right? And I think you can agree with that. And the hard part is that, yeah, it's a competitive market, and every single one of those has to be well calculated. But one of them has to go, right? Like one of them you have to give up all expectations on. And right. And that's really important to understand. And and I don't know if it's as much as holding a delivery back as much as it is like understanding what's being delivered, right? Because so many times it happens, right? Like we set acceptance criteria, and everybody has their own opinion on what that acceptance criteria means, right? They have their own interpretation of what that acceptance criteria means. And I think by setting those expectations early, it's going to be impossible. You're never going to set the expectations perfect. Yeah. So what holds a delivery back, I would ask a question to that question, which is, what are we talking about? Timeline? Are we talking about money? Or are we talking about scope? And one of those, like you said, Brian, has to go. And oftentimes it's going to be time or scope, right? It's going to be, hey, listen, if we want to get this out by, December 1st, we got to cut back scope. If we want to get the scope delivered, we need more time. And of course, more time increases resources. And that's a huge factor. I mean, and I love that analogy. And I think probably the perfect thing here to communicate with this team and everybody listening is to understand those three things from the beginning and understand that all three of those things can change. You might have a partner that comes to you and say, this is going to cost you more, or we go to AWS and it's like, oh, our AWS bill is going to be 3 times what we expected, or hey, we need to hire these 2 new roles, or hey, maybe the scope changes, right? Like we wanted to move, one of the things is about moving money. We thought we could move money this way, but we actually have to move it this way now, which requires these 10 more things to be developed. So,
and I would say too, on the topic of time, delivering X scope within, X amount of time, if there's a milestone that's set for the 15th of the month or the 1st of the month, and that's D-Day, that's when that milestone or that deadline has to be hit, back that up a couple days, put in a buffer for feedback, revisions, unknowns. And if it's got to be the 15th, maybe it really needs to be the 5th or the 10th. And that way you have a little bit of extra cushion there if things do arise, that you can account for those, because working right up until those milestones or those deadlines, that's almost a guarantee that you're not going to hit those deadlines.
Well, and that happens.
downstream
That happens all the time, right? In terms of
Yeah.
unrealistic expectations. I was just approached a couple months ago with a project. They wanted to replace a mobile application by November. This was in August. So one, no way, right? That timeline is not realistic. But then secondly, I know how long it takes to sign a contract in this organization. So I could peel, just backing up from that date, I could peel a month right out. And I went to them from the beginning and I'm like, so you basically have a month to figure out who it's going to be and then no time to implement this. Like, let's just be realistic here and say the RFP process is probably going to be done in November, and then the execution phase will come after that, right? And so from the very outset, like from the moment they approached me with that project, I set realistic expectations there and we adjusted. And this was an organization notorious with not setting those kinds of expectations. And now they're in a more realistic place. And I think that leads to everybody feeling better in an organization too over the long run, because people don't feel as stressed. They don't feel as pressured. They don't feel something breathing down their neck that is unrealistic. And let's be honest here, the people doing the work all know what's realistic and what's not. And so if you approach them as the leader with a deadline that they know is not realistic, who loses credibility there? Right? We do. And so, that's why these things are important. But that's a good example I was just dealing with, where it was like, no, you just peel it off and back into the schedule, back into kind of a high level schedule. You can see very easily, like, no, we really can't even do what you want in that time frame. But then you can go back and offer a solution or offer another suggestion, which is, okay, let's do our discovery. Let's figure out what our requirements are, and let's figure out which vendors we want to implement, and then have a different schedule for implementation. That's realistic as well.
And it's
And
so
the vendor
much
can participate in that, right?
Yeah, and it's so much better to do that stuff at the beginning as well too, and set expectations up front, because if you wait and say, oh sure, we'll deliver that by the 15th, and then the 15th comes and you're not ready, then everybody is like, whoa, what, you said you could deliver this by the 15th. But if you have those conversations and set those expectations in the beginning, then you don't have that panic and that freak out on the 15th.
Yeah.
Another thing, I don't want to completely change the subject, so if you want to go back to it, can, but one of the things about delivering a project or a project being held back that a lot of people miss out on, at least what I've seen recently in my career, is either innovation or the lack of talent. And the thing is, when I mean talent, I just mean pure talent, not resources. Because a lot of the projects I've seen over the last few years, there's innovation. So it's like, well, we think it'll work this way because so-and-so did it. And so not enough like proof of concepts were done early, not enough discovery was done early, and a lot of speculation on like, I think the technology should work. This should work this way. But then when it gets down into the granular weeds and you got the engineer who may not have enough experience with it, takes a lot longer to do the work than everybody expected. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And it, to me, in my opinion, it just comes down to good hiring. And so you can't, the mythical man month. You can't just keep throwing engineers at it if you have the money, if you don't have the right engineers or the right skilled talent. And so, and it gets critical, you know, when you get closer to the deadline, to the delivery, that talent, you know, is if whatever technical decisions that have to be made, if they don't have the experience and the wisdom to be able to execute, and they're, you know, scrambling to try to figure stuff out, that is a huge danger.
Yeah.
And I think you have to trust your team as well too. It does come down to good hiring, right? You have to put you know, great people into those positions that you can trust and work with. But you have to trust your team. You know, in each of their areas, they are experts in their respective areas. You know, whether it's UX or design or engineering or marketing, right? If you've hired those people and you've built a team around that skill set, you have to rely on that skill set. And if something is missing, you know, perhaps you don't, going with the Rust example or the mobile app developer example, you know, and your team lacks that skill set, you have to find those skills. You have to find somebody to supply those skills if you've agreed to, you know, deliver a project that requires those things.
Right.
It's interesting too, as we talk about hiring, because I think about the types of people that I hire, and I never hire for skill of technology. I always hire for skill in critical thinking and problem solving, right? And if someone doesn't know a technology and they know other technologies and they demonstrate the conceptual understanding of how things work, I can teach people code all day long, but I can't teach people to think critically. I can't teach people to ask the right question at the right time about a ticket or about an item. And so, you know, hiring is critically important. I mean, you can hire people that, you know how to code, but won't work well with anybody, right? I knew a guy, I was in a digital agency, pretty prominent one at one point. I knew a guy who was on a major project and just couldn't work with the client at all. Literally to the point where I rolled off a project and the project manager immediately came over to me and was like, hey, this project's gone if I don't get somebody that can actually talk to the client and work in between this architect and the client. Can you do that for me? Right. Knowing that I'd worked with him before and was able to do that. Right. And so those softer skills, I mean, they say it in school, but in reality, like, you really can't teach people to be good people or raise their hands at the right moment or bring the right questions forward to you as the leader. And so that's critically important, maybe even more so than the technical skills, you know, at the end of the day, because if I've got a good person that's going to bring forward a critical issue when I need to know about it, that's much better than, you know, something else, because we're only as good as the people underneath us, right? And so their knowledge is our knowledge. And to the point that was made earlier, like, we don't want to find things out at the last minute, because then we have to tell our business partners we find something out at the last minute. So I'd much rather have a team that's going to raise a red flag, have that conversation, you know, but have that ability to critically think and say, this might be a problem the boss wants to know about that's going to affect the team, right? And you know, that makes delivery more successful as well, because the sooner those people raise those issues, the sooner you can have discussion about them and find solutions to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a huge point with holding delivery back, is like, and not having the right people who could work together, soft skills. Yeah, that works in so many ways. Like you said, dealing with the client, but also works with collaboration with other engineers and just like finger pointing and things like that. And sometimes you could hire people with good soft skills, but then the last point I'll say around the soft skills is creating the right culture of communication and how we handle things. Because you can get talented people, you can get people who have very good soft skills, but then you put them in a toxic room of bad communication, they're not gonna care, they're not gonna vocalize it. You know, it's like one of those things, like if you have a manager that you hire to run it and they're very like, no, we have to hit this headline, like every time someone brings something up, he just yells at them, they're gonna stop bringing stuff up. And so they stop bringing stuff up, you know, we're gonna miss deadline and we're all going to look bad.
Right. That's a really interesting point. So I read recently, there's in fast growing or successful businesses, more mistakes are like, there's more mistakes like registered. For instance, I don't know, just say they'll go around and say, oh, what's happened here? And so like X, Y, and Z. There's been 10 mistakes here, but in poorer, like slower growth or less successful businesses, there's less mistakes made. So you think that's a bit of that doesn't really make sense. But it's because the people in the successful project team, business, whatever it may be, are happy to bring up that they've made that mistake, or that there's something, or that there is something that needs to be fixed. So they're in a better culture or environment, which enables them to be honest, rather than if, like you mentioned, Nathan, if someone's saying, "No, I'm shouting at you if there's a mistake," or you bring something up, then you're not willing to mention it. So therefore, it goes unnoticed until the end, and everyone's like, "Oh, what the f? This has happened." But so yeah, it's really important to have that environment where people can share if there is a mistake, something's fallen over, or whatever else. So
I would echo that. I would echo that so much, Patrick. I think that's great. Is that I've been in organizations, good and bad, and I think you should foster and create a culture where people can speak up if there are issues, and we're all human, mistakes happen. And I think what's important is not that a mistake happened, but what we do next to try and fix it, or prevent it from potentially happening again. But to berate somebody or to get upset because a mistake happened, I mean, that doesn't do any good. And I think it's important to have those discussions and have open lines of communication, as cliche as that sounds, but be able to talk, like when there is an issue and when production has gone down or a database crashes or what have you. That happens, and that's fine. What do we do? What do we do to fix it? What's next on the list to kind of resolve it? Not that it actually happened,
Yeah, totally.
If mistakes are the way that we learn and grow at the end of the day, right? If you make mistakes, if you fail, you can learn and grow from that. Everybody should. We all make mistakes, right? And so, the question I ask somebody when they make a mistake is, what did you learn from it? Right? What are you going to do that'll make sure that doesn't happen again? You keep making the same mistakes again and again, then there's an issue, right? But we all make mistakes, myself included. And so all we can do is learn and grow from our mistakes to do better. And I think the reason that teams that make more mistakes are more successful is because of that, because they are constantly learning, constantly growing, right? And so, yeah, you make a mistake, but you should probably not. Look, when I was early in my career, I wiped a whole production database out by mistake. Okay. I ran an update statement. I forgot the where clause.
Wow.
I own that mistake. I spent my night repairing that database and restoring that data, and I fixed it. And I'll tell you what, every time to this day I'm writing a query, I always make sure there's a where clause on the end of the update statement because I learned the hard way, right? And so we all make mistakes. And my boss was very forgiving and understanding. He saw that I was trying to own it, that I wanted to make it right and do whatever I could, and that I owned it immediately, right? And so, I actually ended up being promoted in that company despite doing that, right? So, I mean, it's how we learn and grow, all of us. And the more mistakes we make, as long as we have good people, going back to what we were saying before, that will learn and grow from those, and will identify the opportunity for growth, then make as many mistakes as you want, because we're all getting better over time.
One of the things I really love about that I just have to speak up and add to it is that when mistakes are made, like, do make every effort, because a lot of people, especially not bad managers, a lot of good managers do this actually, is they jump to the first assumption of what mistake was made. And then they try to fix that. And sometimes you just like take a breather, take your time and analyze the mistake that was made, whatever it was, and say, what was the root cause of that mistake? Like, I'll give you a bad example that recently happened to a friend of mine where a new merge was made and the release went out and it broke something with the customer. So immediately the response to the manager at the moment was like, okay, we got to revert that launch. We got to revert everything. And then we got to deploy the other. And they basically assumed the merge created the problem, right? They thought that was the mistake. It didn't have enough reviews. They spent all this time reverting everything and get everything back to where it was. And when it was just a really small, simple thing that if they would have taken the time to analyze, all they had to do was adjust the scale and everything would have been fine. But instead, it did several things. It created distrust in the management, distrust in the team, distrust in the ability to merge. It broke the system. It was actually down for much longer than it should have been. There was a lot of problems ahead. And why? The management team was too reactive. And they didn't take the time and say, okay, let's actually look at what's going on here. Let's take, at least 30 minutes to analyze this. And so when you're analyzing the mistake, analyzing the root of the problem, obviously you understand what you did wrong, all those things were right. But I think when it comes to like delivering, if you're in continuous delivery, like just take a breather, take your time. Don't be so reactive to problems and mistakes that you run into.
Oh, excellent advice. I think it all comes down to, like I mentioned before at the start, time, resource, and scope. Making sure that we're giving people enough time, or there's enough time in the project. Making sure that the scope's correct, and also obviously having the resource there and the culture within that resource to be able to deliver what we need. So no, that's all really great advice. And then I suppose again may have been answered slightly already, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper in terms of sort of delivery models or ways of working that you have seen show the best results, guys.
Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and jump in. So at Book Outdoors, we actually have a hybrid model. So one of the things I'll say is that I'll contrast the difference in project management versus product management. And at Book Outdoors, we're much more product focused. We have our main website, BookOutdoors.com. We have an admin site as well too that basically controls everything that you see on the Book Outdoors site. So for us, it's not like we're doing a single project. It's much different from, say, a digital agency where it's project focused. We are continually improving our product, adding new features and new things to the system to better improve the experience, et cetera. So for us, we're a hybrid model. So I've actually taken, I would say, a mashup of Kanban and Agile, and I've borrowed from kind of the two philosophies. I like Kanban because it's continuous integration, continuous development. Because if we hit a sprint or if we hit a milestone or deadline, there's going to be one right behind it, and it is a marathon. It's continuous. It's not like it's one and done. And I like, there are elements of both of those systems that I like. So we're a hybrid of Kanban and Scrum and Agile. I like the ceremonies with Agile. I like having the daily stand-up. I like structuring things within a sprint. I think where Agile and Scrum start to fall down is I think when you start assigning things sizes and numbers, and you spend more time trying to construct a sprint than actually doing a sprint, I think that's where that system starts to fall down. And so we are currently operating in sort of a hybrid model because we're continually improving our product. We're making our service better, making the experience better. And for us, I found that works fairly well. I think the downfall, the last thing I'll say on this, I think the downfall of picking one system, whether it's waterfall, Kanban, Agile, et cetera, is going all in on that one methodology and being a hardliner on a particular methodology, because I think you sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture. So in Agile, like I just said, you can get so caught up in t-shirt sizing or point sizing that you actually forget, what are you working on? What are you trying to deliver within a sprint? So I think finding the model that works best for you and not being a hardliner is really the best way to do it. You have to kind of meet your team or your organization kind of where they are and the skill sets that they have. And I think, picking the right model that kind of adapts to your situation or your organization.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I would build on that by saying, I want to look at delivery models as macro delivery models and micro delivery models. Scrum and Kanban, micro delivery models. Scaled Agile, project management lifecycle, macro delivery models, right? So there's two different models out there first. Second, I've never worked in a company that's used a pure play agile method at all, ever. It's just not, conceptually, it sounds great, but when the rubber meets the road, it's not practical. Early in my career, when Agile said we should do pair programming, I looked at that and went to a boss and talked to a boss about that. And he was like, so you want me to double our headcount? That's not going to happen, right? So we have to be practical and realistic. These methods are all out there with different, problems that they've solved for different reasons. And so, if you borrow from the different methods and build, one that works for your organization, given your considerations and your constraints, you will be successful. What works for a product organization, I've worked in product organizations before, what works for a product-based organization doesn't work for an organization that has to deal with vendors and integrations. I've worked in those before. And that doesn't necessarily work in an organization that does software as a service. I've worked in those organizations before. And so, each organization has its own way of approaching things. I'm kind of running more Kanban Scrum hybrid right now, but I've been in places where a pure play Scrum method was needed because the people didn't have the discipline to be able to estimate things properly or story or prioritize. And so we needed those ceremonies, we needed those rules and those guideposts for them so that they would, they needed the discipline to be able to do that and force the issue on prioritization and giving us the right direction. Other organizations, they're like, you choose the priorities, and that makes it a lot easier, right? You don't need as many ceremonies or as much time on those kinds of things. At the macro level, delivery is all about governance. At the end of the day, pick the right things, focus on what you want to do in a specific fiscal year, and then get those things done really well, right? The problem I see with almost every company I work with when I come in is they want to take too much on in a given year. And I can look at what they want to do and tell them, you're not going to get more than 5 of these, or maybe 10 of them. And they'll have a list of 30 deep, right? And they know how many people you have. And they've previously gone into years like this. And they're like, well, we only got like 3 things done, but we had 30 on the list. Oh, why was that? Well, we were trying to work on all these other things. Well, no, let's focus on 3 this year and try to get those done and see if we can beat that number, right? And then if there's more, you have slack and you find out you're running ahead, you pull more in, right? You have a backlog of projects that you want to pull from, just like you have a backlog of tickets you want to pull from, right? And so you pull the next one in and the next one. But if you undercommit and then pull things in, you're much more successful being focused like that than overextending yourself and having people going all over the place at the macro level, trying to get projects going, and nothing gets done at that point, right? And so, but I do want to distinguish the two, because in my career, I found there are very big differences between the governance model and the macro processes for delivery versus the more micro processes for delivery around execution, requirements, definition, and product development. And product development has a little bit of that too, in road mapping as well. But just kind of bringing that up because only in recent years have I gotten exposed to like SAFe, Scaled Agile, and some of the more macro Agile frameworks that are out there. And even there, I've been training on those. And in the organization I wanted to use SAFe in, I didn't implement SAFe wholly exactly as it was in the training or as the method called for, because some of it just didn't make sense for the client I was working with, right? So you take what works, you use it as a way to mature process and to get people all marching in the same direction and to hold it and drive accountability. And you discard the things that won't work for you, or you try them out later, or you discard something that doesn't work. And that's the last point, is this delivery process, continuous improvement, right? We should be continually improving our delivery process. If something isn't working for us, why do we keep doing it, right? So that's where the retros come in and other things, but both at the macro and the micro level, if the way we're intaking prioritizing projects doesn't work, discard it, find a new way to do it, right? But find something that works for your organization that people can understand, can work with, can adopt and embrace, and don't be a zealot. Don't say it has to be pure play this, because it almost never is.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just add one small thing to that I think a lot of Scrum Masters and managers and even upper management fail to do is, once they choose a model or they begin a model, they don't follow data and they just follow feelings. And so when you have these retros, make sure that you're applying data to the metros. Like, and it could be simple data of like, how much did we accomplish this sprint or this quarter, and what can we do to improve that? And so sometimes people just go by feelings. And feelings are good because a lot of times our feelings is based on data, but it's important to actually define those metrics early. Like, what are we going to track in our model so that next year we don't try to put in 30 things because we actually have evidence. We only accomplished these three things because of X, Y, Z. Are we going to change those X, Y, Z's? No. So we're only going to accomplish 3 this year. And so by having that data, you can kind of squash a lot of the optimism or the toxic optimism that can be created. So, and I love it. I love the excitement on some managers I've had in the past, but I mean, we got to excitement, but we have to have metrics that show the evidence of how things are going.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about data and just having data to back up feeling.
Sorry, go on. I was just going to add. So obviously, in our business, as we grow, or any company they're trying to deliver or reach a target of some type, emotion can take over quite often. So you do have to have that data, or the MIR reports or whatever it may be, to understand exactly where you're going and how you're going to get there. So whatever model it is that you use, whether it's Kanban, Scrum, Waterfall, whatever it is, there still has to be those metrics built in to understand what good looks like. And if we're straying away from that, why? And then pull the project or whatever is back onto where it needs to be. And that's, I suppose, as leaders, ourselves or whatever else, that is a really important part of our job, is to make sure that we know what the standards are, as we mentioned earlier. And the
interrupt you here to add on to that. It's like also knowing what metrics are important to you will also tell you what model you should follow. Like hitting timelines because you have some sort of like marketing release schedule. If that's more important, it'll tell you that like, hey, maybe we need to adjust scope, or hey, we need to have sprints and Scrum. But if it's more about velocity and just putting stuff out and it's less about timeline, it's like, oh, we're heavy Kanban, right? Like, so knowing what your metrics that you need to follow, whether it's velocity or timeline, then it's really important. And not just like, hey, I like Scrum, or hey, I like Kanban, so let's all do Kanban. It's like, okay, why? Like, what are the metrics you're trying to track? What are the team you're trying to build? What are the personalities that you're dealing with? Like Bryan said, that's so true. It's like, you're excited about doing Kanban, and you're like, okay, nobody can scope the next 2 weeks because you're looking at one day at a time. So,
yeah. And I think people underestimate the usefulness of metrics and burn down charts as well too, if it applies, for the project or a product that you're working on. But they can be great indicators, in terms of where you are in a sprint. Are you on track to meet that sprint? Are you above or ahead? And also I think too, if you pay attention to those things, it can help. If you pay attention, I'll say that again, it can help prevent things like burnout and things like that. So not overloading your engineers, or not underloading your engineers, making sure that there is adequate work for them to work on, but not to the point that they're overloaded. So I think it's good to use metrics to kind of find that balance too.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, we've had some really great advice there. I'm conscious of time. So we'll move on to the last bit of a fun question. But what's the best and worst advice you've received from ever? We'll probably keep it in the constraints of around project delivery, not just in anything, because I've received and given loads of bad advice in normal life. So. But yeah, best and worst advice that we've given in project delivery, Bryan.
I think the best advice I've gotten is to hire great people and get out of their way. Right. That comes with some caveats. You have to have people that you can trust to get out of their way, right? That they're going to do the right things, that they're going to raise their hand when they need to raise their hand. But I actually had an engineer say that to me, just get out of our way, we'll take care of it. And I listened, and, somebody I trusted. And so I did that. And it was, very much manifested as hire great people and get out of their way. Right. That's what we bring them on board for, to do their job. So just stay out, let them do it. Trust that they will do their job and that they will raise things to you at the appropriate time, and trust that your hiring practices are good.
Lovely. Adam?
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say trust your team. That was something I learned very early on in my career. Is relying on the expertise and the experience of your team, and that I think allows you to move faster. It also builds trust within your organization as well too. And then I would say some of the worst advice I got is I was told in one organization to avoid conflict, which, leads to resentment and hurt feelings. And not saying everybody should put on the boxing gloves and duke it out, but I think trying to sweep everything under the rug is just not healthy for anybody. So yeah, that's a point of worst advice that I definitely would stay away from.
That's it. And Nathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple there, like you said, but I mean, to not repeat what the other guy said, which I 100% agree with those, I would say, like, follow the data, and a lot of times in the past in my career, I love data and I'd have it, but I wouldn't follow it to lead. And I think that requires two things. It requires you to actually collect the data, for one, and then follow the data. It's very truthful. But I would say the best advice is definitely along hiring great and trusting them.
But just one point, just to finish up on that, the capturing of the data, and this is a question to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
How often have you seen that businesses or organizations that you've worked in or you've heard of just are not doing that correctly? Because it seems like such a simple thing.
Yeah.
100%.
All the time.
100% of the companies I've worked with either they do not capture the data properly or they don't follow the data properly. And you know what? And I'm to blame for that as well. Like, I could be ambitious and optimistic on how I do it, but then in execution, I can always improve. But so many don't.
Yeah, I would say so many organizations like to go with the feelings, go with the gut, and say, "Oh yeah, it's working," and not looking at the data. So I would say more ignore the data than more actually do execute on the data.
Well, we're
so
creating vanity metrics. Right.
Yes.
Like they choose the wrong data to follow.
Right.
And it's just vanity. It just makes them feel like these numbers feel good. These other ones don't. So I don't believe those.
We don't talk about that.
Yeah. We're talking about the ones that feel good.
It's one of those things. Reporting is always the forgotten requirement set in any project that I've been on. Nobody's ever like, what reports are we going to produce for this thing that'll be useful to the business? It's always after a project goes live that people are like, I need these reports on this information. And that's usually when people realize we're missing data, right? And so a lot of times it is a very common problem to not have that data. I've actually started in recent years making sure that any project that starts out and has a technology component has a section for KPIs that will be measured as part of that project's success, right? So under success criteria, what are the KPIs for success? We measure that, we state what those are. That is basically bringing forward reporting and potential data requirements at the very beginning to intake. It's actually in my intake form. And that actually has helped solve a lot of that problem, along with me going, now everybody always forgets about reporting and data. So what do we want to do here? Because you can't go back and get the data that's missing. You can only go forward and put that data in, right? So if you want the data since inception, we got to understand it now. And if you start talking about it early with people and bring it up, because they're not going to think about it, they will think about it, and they will say, okay, here's how we're going to measure it. And oftentimes that maps into strategic plans and strategic KPIs and things like that. And you can sanity check that and go, well, over here, it's registered users that we're being graded on. So why on this project is it active users, right?
So many startups thinks that's only for like optimizing your efficiency, like 5 years down the road, or that's an enterprise problem. And it's like, if startups understand that, like, this could very well be the reason you fail is because you did not do this day one. And
it's how you
get MVP out. It's like, you might not get MVP out if you don't track your efficiency today.
You say, hey, we're
Yeah.
going to budget 20 hours for a project. And then you look back and you're like, oh, we actually spent 75 hours for a particular project. And like, why did we do that? Well, if you track, your progress, if you keep metrics, during the project, it can help with stuff like that.
Right. That's right.
So this has been absolutely fantastic. So many good takeaways to have. Thank you guys so much for giving us your time today. It's been really, really insightful. Great sharing. Lots of takeaways. So I've made lots of notes. I'm sure everyone else has as well. I've learned a lot, so I can use this now when talking to people. So I pretend I know what I'm. So I sound like I know what I'm talking about. So thanks. But all jokes aside, appreciate your time. It's been fantastic. Recording will come out soon, and appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for
Nathan.
having me. Nice to meet you guys, and welcome connecting on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, team.